Generation slavery seems positive, at least for slave women. The downside is that new slaves needed to be captured and imported to restock the ever-dwindling slave numbers. Since many of the slaves came from poorly defended Europe, it meant that European women remained vulnerable to capture and kidnapping for sale in the Muslim slave markets for the whole of the medieval period and into the modern period. For one Arabic writer, a former intelligence officer for the Abbasids, described the slave trade in approximately 870. He listed Spanish, Frankish, Lombard, Greek, and Slavic boys, eunuchs, and concubines being shipped not just to Baghdad, but across the Mediterranean to Egypt. There they were put on camels headed for the Red Sea, where they would be shipped to India and China. The stellar social mobility of slave women in Islamic society was a combination of the religious text vetting of concubinage, the Walid laws granting freedom for mothers and children, the example left by the Abbasid dynasty and their huge harems. For example, in 500 years of the Abbasid Caliphate, only 3 of the dynasty's caliphs were born from free women. All the rest had slave mothers. The pattern was followed by Islamic courts into the modern period. This meant that when the next ruler was a minor, his mother, formerly a foreign slave, often captured from Europe, became the regent ruling the realm from behind a curtain or through eunuchs. It also meant that queen mothers held incredible power in influencing the appointment of officials or the decisions of even their grown sons. These women often grew incredibly wealthy, having the tax revenue from great tracts of land, as well as bribes and gifts from sycophants, merchants, and diplomats, hoping for imperial favor. One of the first examples of a slave girl who ruled a Muslim empire is Khairazan, a concubine who talked her way into the Abbasid harem from the slave market in Mecca. She was given to the caliph's son, who loved her enough to free her, marry her, and give her 4 children. 2 of her sons ruled the Abbasid Empire. She was suspected of plotting her older son, Hadi's death, in order to put her more compliant son, Harun al-Rashid, on the throne. During her life, she oversaw an extensive palace and was a patron of building projects in Mecca. When she died, her annual income was 160 million dirhams. That's equal to half of the empire's annual taxes. Her estate included many, many slaves and 18,000 brocaded dresses. Not bad money for an ex-slave farmhand's daughter from Yemen. Slavery allowed these slave women access to the elite and the power of the court by virtue of their reproductive relationship with the men who held power. The Ottomans have a period called the Sultanate of Women, when for 130 years, or longer, says some Turkish scholars, slave women, usually the daughters of Orthodox priests, captured by Tartars, Corsair pirates, or Ottoman armies, effectively ruled the Ottoman Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries. Slave girls had another route to wealth and power, other than just producing sons for the elite. The Islamic Near East inherited a long tradition of using female slave musicians to enliven elite homes and royal courts with songs and instrumental music. Because of the sexual innuendo that was required for musical performance, the work was considered unworthy for free women, leaving a monopoly for slaves. Slaves were able to move in the streets and perform publicly in ways that free Muslim women could not. In many ways, singing slaves were freer than free women, who were facing seclusion in the women's quarters due to increasing requirements for honor. Residents of Baghdad, Cordoba, etc., who couldn't afford their own private singing girls could attend literary salons, where owners of trained girls would present their talents in return for expensive gifts. After extensive training in music and poetry, ideally starting at about age 9, these geisha-type courtesans would use suggestive glances, poetry written on their bodies, repartee, love notes, and songs to attract the attentions of a suitor. The most successful of these musicians could string along several men at a time until all of the man's resources had been gifted to both girl and her owner, and the lover was cast aside for the next suitor. We know of many of these girls, and their names even, because male writers wrote essays, encyclopedias, and poetry about their beauty, talent, and romantic conquest. Some of these singers had memorized or written over 1,000 songs. Of course, if you shame your owner by forgetting a verse, you face being beat. Since these slave women were masters at creating poetry and catchy tunes to praise or vilify politicians, it was incumbent on aspiring public figures to guarantee with rich gifts that all public references to themselves were favorable. Many girls were able to buy or be gifted their freedom. They then purchased and trained their own stable of talented slave girls to farm out for performances. These singing slave women became rich and powerful as major cultural forces in the royal courts and their own literary salons. Now, through producing songs or sons, slave women in the Islamic realms had access to power, wealth, and status not available to slave women or even free concubines in Christian Europe. This social mobility stemmed from Islam's religious texts approving of concubines, from the manumission available to female slaves to producing children, and through the Abbasid turn to a Persian-style governance that secluded the ruler in the harem and used slaves to birth the next generation, and from the popularity of the female slave courtesans. Why these differences in the slave experience between the Christian North and the Islamic West, South, and East? I believe that the answer lies in the great shift east the Islamic society made to capture the ancient Persian empires that they had conquered. As early as Hammurabi's law, slave women who produced a child were freed and their sons could inherit. The Sassanid Persians would capture numerous girls to raise in the harem for future use as concubines. And perhaps the Sassanids were copying the Chinese patterns. Concurrent with the rise of the Arab empires, the Tang dynasty had built the largest capital city in the world and produced a cultural explosion still known as the Golden Age of China. The 8th century court, Xuanzong, set the bar for displays of ostentation. 30,000 performers and concubines were reputed to be kept by the Tang imperial palace. Islamic society copied this Asian pattern of feminine slavery. The result was that the Muslim society around the Mediterranean provided slave women, or at least those who could fight their way to the top of harem politics, with social mobility and access to power and wealth not available to their counterparts in Christendom. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Catherine Hein, for sticking to the time limit and then very well and give us a very interesting insight about dynamics of concubinage across the Christian and the Islamic world.